We are live with SCI TV. I'm Joshua Gordon, joined today by Ted Lewis. Ted, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing great today. Thanks.
So Ted, I'm really excited for our conversation. Restorative justice is a very interesting thing for us to contemplate in the sports space, and this is your area of expertise. So we want to pick your brain and first start by asking you a little bit about what restorative justice is, and then we'll talk a little bit about how you got involved in this and how it might apply for sports.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. Glad to talk about it. Restorative justice is kind of the new kid on the block in the sense that it's providing an alternative for dealing with harm issues or crimes or conflicts. But in other respects, it's really not a new kid on the block. The principles of repairing harm, that benefits the entire community is really an ancient practice that many tribal communities have been using for centuries. And so really what's happened in the North American context is about 40 years ago, some folks sort of rediscovered these principles of focusing on the harm more than just the law broken. And that's one way to really sum it up. If you focus on the harm more than the law broken, you're really dealing with relationships. Relationships between people really matter. Communities get affected by harm. And so once you kind of focus a little more on the impacts, the ripple effects of a problem, you're looking at processes that engage those people, kind of empower them back together, open up communication, let apologies happen, let people take responsibility. It's what I call putting a human face on a justice process.
And certainly when we're talking about athletics, where we're really talking about relationships being at the cornerstone of a lot of what we do in sports. So many sports are team sports, but even if they're an individual sport, you're talking about folks having to deal with coaches and agents and other folks around them. This sounds very promising. Can you talk a little bit before we get into some of the applications in sport about what drove you into this space and how you ended up here?
I've been involved in this field for about 20 years, and in fact, half of those years was right there in Eugene, Oregon, where you're based. And my specialty has been in victim offender conferencing. So I've worked with a number of nonprofits that partner with the justice system. And then I train volunteers that do mediation facilitation work with victims and offenders or people in dispute to come together and work things out together. And then about 3 years ago, I started working with Dr. Mark Umbright at the Center for Restorative Justice and Peacemaking at the University of Minnesota. He's considered one of the founding figures in the movement, so it's been a real honor for me to be able to work alongside with him, do trainings with him. And it's really become a passion for me to help expand this field because it's now being applied way beyond the criminal realm. It's being applied in schools, workplaces, international conflicts. And I think what really is inspiring me today is that it could really expand well in the sports world, simply because so much sports has to do with, like you said, team and relationship dynamics.
Yeah, and so if I were to draw the Venn diagram between those who are experts in sports and those who are experts in conflict resolution, there's a very small overlap between those two in my experience. And it's something we've tried to broaden. And so I'm really excited for you to, especially in the restorative justice side of things, to help expand people's vantage point. And so if someone's an athletic director or a general manager or coach, can you help lay out for them what that would look like? You've written a bit on some case studies in this area, and you've thought about this quite a bit. What could it look like in a particular incident to, one, engage a traditional approach, and then what it would look like in a restorative justice approach and how that would compare and contrast?
Yeah, happy to talk about that. One of the cases I got involved at one point was with a hockey team. And one of the players had a serious injury who had already been part of that team for many years. And what happened is that some real tensions developed between the team captain and this other player who was injured, but was still allowed to suit up, take part in all of their travels and everything like that. Well, there was a major fight that worked out in the locker room. And And it's not like that was the only episode, but that became the episode that kind of pushed things to the forefront. But under that was months and months of tensions. And I think what happens is that those kinds of tensions can really affect team morale, just the quality of how the team is getting along, and that eventually affects performance. So obviously a coach could have just said, "You're out of here." But because this particular fight led to an actual criminal charge because of injuries, the police were able to bring that case into my program, and then I prepared different people on the team with preparation meetings, and eventually brought people together for conversation so that they could just talk out, the difficulties that led up and escalated the conflict in the first place. What it really comes down to is repairing all of those points of disconnection and tension, and giving people the safe place to talk about it, and it just kind of takes all that negative energy out of the air so that things just go back to normal more again.
I think sometimes people underestimate the extent of the harm, right? And if you think about even a classic example like Kermit Washington and Rudy Tomjanovich in the NBA, where there was an incident where Rudy, for those who aren't familiar, where Rudy had gone after a loose ball, and there was some scrum, and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was involved as well, and then Kermit Washington threw a punch that was very reactive in that moment, and the punch did significant damage. It shattered his orbital bone. And the amount of media and press, as we see in sports now more than ever, and this was even many decades ago, swarmed and swooped in and characterized this as a really violent act by an individual, and essentially ostracized him over time from the NBA, to the point where when he was still playing, he couldn't go to a hotel without having some sort of fake name, or else they would try and poison his food. And to this day, many, many decades later, both have tried to be involved in sport in different capacities, but the two of them have never sat down and had a conversation.
Yeah, and you use the word ostracize there, and that's really vital. It's like, do you separate people, or do you have a way to bring them back together again? A similar case at the NFL level is with Michael Vick, who played for the Falcons for a while, then got charged with that dogfighting situation in 2007. Had a couple years where he had to do time and other kinds of conventional reparations. When he came back out, at least he was able to try to connect a bit with some new teams. I think the Eagles picked him up for a while, but then he moved on. And one interesting bit is when the Steelers were interested in him last summer, there was a lot of kickback from fans and other people because of that old reputation. And to me, that illustrates how restorative justice is really trying to help an offender get their dignity back by earning good trust. In other words, there has to be opportunity for offenders to demonstrate that they're learning, they're taking responsibility, they're wanting to go down a better path, they've apologized. And once those positives are out there in a sufficient public manner, then that's what offsets that negative reputation that otherwise tarnishes their ongoing future.
And so often athletes have various forms of advisors around them, and the classic response seems to be to put out some sort of damage control when an incident happens, and to do some sort of press release or public statement. Often it might contain an apology, sometimes good, sometimes not good. You and I could critique apology probably quite well. But why is that not enough? Why do we not stop at apology when there's been a harm?
It's because there's a verbal dimension to resolution, and then there's sort of a practical dimension to resolution. You say it, but you have to show it. And so what's pretty typical for most victim offender conferences or mediations is there's rich dialogue in the meeting, but then there's some kind of a signed agreement where the offending party agrees to do X, Y, and Z to make amends. And without that, there really isn't what's called the positive accountability that kind of offsets the negative of the past. There's a great example in at UCLA. It's a pretty old case, but in 1999, 14 UCLA football players during the summer had stolen some handicap placards and put them in their cars so that they could park, next to the gym. Well, when that was exposed, it caused a huge stir in the campus. The whole handicap community was in an uproar. The media, got involved. People were making the athletes feel like they were just lowlifes. And I've got an interesting quote here. At the front end of that problem, the assistant vice chancellor said, "There was such a high profile on this particular situation that I felt it was necessary to reintegrate the offenders into the campus community." And, he could have said it was such a high profile situation, we just needed to get rid of them, like a punishment by expulsion. But the fact that he said, because it was high profile, we had to reintegrate them, is a great testimony to his vision to know that real justice, real restoration means you heal the community and you heal the reputation. So this particular case had 46 people come together for a conference that lasted a good part of a day. They had to take a lunch break. All sorts of different players were there to talk it through. The offenders agreed to a whole bunch of amends-making activities. And that campus learned a profound lesson where they could kind of save face by going down that alternative path rather than stretching it out in litigation, which just separates people and makes them more frustrated.
A great example. And I think from our experience, athletic directors and coaches and folks in this industry are very pragmatic people. Can you talk about why this not only may be the right thing to do at a very human level, but also why it could be the right decision for them to embrace a restorative justice approach if they're basically trying to save money or perform better on the field?
Well, like I said earlier, it's certainly good for the morale of the team when you don't just exclude someone that already has a bond. I'm thinking of Adrian Peterson being here in Minnesota. When he was taken out in 2014 for the incident that he had with his son in Texas, that really affected the team because it kind of ripped him out of the fabric of them working together. And so there's that aspect. But the other thing that I think is important to realize to just make a good choice and do the right thing is that there are always impacted victims in any harm situation. And a lot of times we kind of focus mostly on the offender, how are we going to punish them and all of that. But restorative justice wants to give balanced attention to the victims and communities that are affected. That's just the right thing to do, is to pay greater attention. And when you bring offenders and victims together for safe conversation, or in a sports context, when you bring an impacted team together with an offending athlete who's done some off-field deviant activity, it's really allowing them to strengthen things back together again rather than just creating more separation.
Great. And as we begin to wrap the conversation, any final thoughts that you want to share with our audience about restorative justice or this space in general as we think about it in the context of sports?
I think it's timely for this kind of model to come into professional sports more. It's already being worked at pretty well on a lot of university and campus levels, even though we're finding that that's still an alternative for misconduct. But I think it can come more into the professional world. And the reason is because if you look at just what's happening in the business world or organization, there are new theories that say to have healthy organizations, you have to have a systems approach and you have to be mindful of healthy relationships between people. Good good leaders in businesses now are recognizing those two things, and they're finding that it actually affects profit and performance. And so bringing it back into professional sports, you're dealing with relationships and systems that are very complicated because there's high stakes with money and lots of stakeholders, lots of interest groups, and all the more reason to have a systems approach or a relation approach to mending the harm, rather than having processes that cause more pain, more separation, more frustration, because people are just sidelined out of that system or community. We use the word community in the same way.
Ted, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on this. I think it's a really excellent approach for athletes and coaches and administrators and others to become much more adept at and well aware of. Certainly, folks like yourself who are in the trenches doing this are of the utmost importance. And so thank you for sharing this in this space. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Great to partner with you.
Okay, talk to you again soon. Bye.